So hello all, I'm Ruby Sinreich. I work at a wonderful organization called Moms Rising. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm speaking on the land of Ino, Okanichi, Catawba, and many other Native people, some of whom still live here in central North Carolina. And I'm going to tell you 5 things I think you need to know about site building. I've been using Drupal on and off since 2005, which means I started with version 4.7, which some people care about. I've worked at small, medium, and large organizations, and I've been a freelancer. I've met and gotten to know all kinds of developers, including core and contrib maintainers, through my work with Drupal Diversity and Inclusion, my local user group, and conferences like this. And I'm going to try to talk really fast, and I'm going to try to stick to my notes when I talk because I only have 15 minutes. And this was originally a full hour, but I changed it to a lightning talk in hopes of getting selected this year, which worked. So I very much encourage your discussion in the chat. If you have a question that you actually want me to respond to, put it in the Q&A so that it doesn't get lost in the chat. And I will try to follow the chat, but I really can't make any promises about that, especially, again, given the tight time frame. Before I go on, I just have to say it's been a terrible week for police violence. Last night, my heart exploded with rage at the news of another police murder of a boy named Adam Toledo in Chicago. He was just 1 year older than my own son. Sometimes it's so upsetting I can hardly function, and it feels kind of weird to keep going with business as usual, like doing this talk. So I wanted to at least mention this, and this is Lenny here. Please take some time to learn about privilege and structural oppression, connect to other human beings, make donations if you can, and do whatever you can to build a better world for all of our children. The farther you feel from the impact of police violence, the more work that you personally can and must do to change these systems. If people want to post links in the chat to other fundraisers or organizations related to this, please do. And on the screen, I have a link to a talk that Tara King and I did a couple years ago at Bad Camp. We've actually done it a bunch of times, but it's my favorite version of it to help you understand some of these issues and why they actually super matter to Drupal. Okay, so of course my cat's gonna do this. I don't have to tell you how important it is to understand who you're building your software for. It's the cardinal rule. This is why we have user stories and personas and user testing and almost the entire field of user experience. A lot of people think of content editors as the end users of Drupal, but site builders are also key users, and our work is what helps those content editors have a better experience. Some site builders are part of a team working alongside developers, designers, project managers, etc. But many of us work for very small organizations like nonprofits, small businesses, or different types of places like government, public media, or higher education. Drupal has been working to improve the user experience for content authors and editors, as we know. But long before and sometimes after those end users touch the site, it's site builders that put the pieces together to make things work for everyone, from content editors to first-time visitors to a site. We're often the linchpin of a project, but we are also not often understood by the people who are making the tools that we use to build awesome websites. We often struggle to do things that may seem simple to you because we aren't working with the same resources or assumptions. So today, I want to help you better understand the typical site builder. These are all generalizations, so of course they don't apply in every case, even though, being me, I will tend to state things very strongly. Now, this whole talk was put together before I saw Dries' keynote. It was so rude of him to give my talk for me. No, I'm just kidding. But so much of what he talked about is actually, you'll see repeated here. And I was so glad to hear him talk about many of the same issues that I have been concerned about and that are in this presentation. For the past few years, I have really been feeling like site builders are being left behind. So it was a relief to hear that he thinks that too. I don't always catch every single of his keynotes, and I don't go to every single DrupalCon, but I've been to 5 DrupalCons in the past 8 years, and this one really hit home for me in New Orleans. In this talk, he was sharing the State of Drupal survey, which they do after each big new release, I believe. And D8 had just been released about 6 months before this survey, which asked who should be prioritized in the initiatives that Dries was proposing. And one of the big priorities that came out of that survey was migration improvement that you now see in Drupal 8, which I hope to use someday, but my site's still on D7, but I'm getting to that. So in this talk in 2016 and this week, Dries called us site builders non-technical users, which kind of makes steam come out my ears. So the first of the things I want you to know is we actually have a lot of technical skills. Don't confuse site builders with site administrators and content editors. We do a very wide range of things, and because of that, it's hard for us to specialize, right? So it's not a simple matter for us to create a module or a patch. It's not always worth the hassle for us to maintain a local dev environment. And if you require that, for example, to contribute to Drupal, you're causing a major hassle and actually excluding people. We're often not allowed to create things like modules or patches, or even sometimes install them depending on our hosting environments. We may have to put in tickets, or we may just not have the opportunity to do it at all, or we may not be able to afford it. However, we can kick butt. We make great sites using site configuration, views, context, layout builder, tons more, right? We often are very good with HTML, CSS, JavaScript. So we actually have a lot of different technical skills. We just don't have very deep specialties. We're never going to be the biggest PHP pro you ever meet. But we have a wide range of skills. What we don't have that you have is resources. We often work on very small teams and have very small budgets. In my case, for example, I am the web shop of 1.5 people. My supervisor helps me a little bit, but he's the CTO and he's a little busy. So we don't have the same resources you have. We are like developers, but on teeny tiny budgets. We don't always want to use the latest shiny cool new things, including the latest versions of Drupal, when we're still on a supported version. Some organizations recognize this and make efficient use of contrib modules, so we don't have to hire devs to write custom code that then gets outdated and we can't afford to update, right? We also can't specialize in hosting and sysops, so we need hosts that understand how to do good care and feeding of Drupal. However, some of the ones that do that best with managed hosting cater to dev shops. So they'll often have some great tools like multi-dev environments, but they don't give access to them to small accounts. And their pricing structure is also extremely difficult to us. And so, you know, we're getting priced out of those. And so there are really no good hosts for small shops and individual in-house developers like me. So we're not alone, though, in wanting to avoid the bleeding edge. In fact, the majority of Drupal sites are still running Drupal 7. So even though I know I'm an outlier here at this conference, and I always feel like I have to remind people that hey, some of us are still on D7, actually the majority of sites still are. As you can see, I did an earlier version of this talk last year, and I can see a really big uptake actually in Drupal 8 and some 9 since I last pulled these stats. At that last year, D7 was more than 2/3 of all the sites running Drupal on the web. And we can see here that overall adoption of Drupal has gone down since the release of D8. This could be related to the increase in difficulty of using it. Up until Drupal 8, migrations have been very, very expensive for us in time and development costs. So for many people, it's just not worth it because it ain't broke. Speaking of things that aren't worth it, we don't use a lot of the big power tools that some of you all love. We're only working on a couple of sites at a time. For people in a dev shop, you're making new sites and you're using tools that make that very efficient, but that's not always helpful for us. Even in academia or situations where they have a whole network of sites, they aren't making all new custom sites all the time. And especially in those bigger institutional settings, site builders often don't have direct access to their server or permissions for command line tools. We may not even have access to the server or ability to fully use Drush or Composer. Even on some of those nice managed hosts, we can't use all the Drush commands. So remember, we're often working on shared servers and we're not set up for things like automated testing or CI. Personally, I use things like Drush and Lando so infrequently that I don't remember the commands I need. So for a task I do once a month or less than that, I'd like to have a graphical user interface. That's one of my wish list things to put on Dree's initiatives. So speaking of figuring out how to do things, sometimes we are lone rangers. Site builders have to figure out a lot of things on our own. Because we're not usually on big teams with other developers, we have to figure out how to solve our own problems. So we rely on the community. We especially need clear documentation, and we use support communities like Slack. In the old days, we used to use the Drupal.org forums. I sometimes find myself looking things up in the Fields API when I'm modifying a template or some code, and it's frankly very hard for me to use. Like, I'm looking at that page, it's like I understand the words and I don't understand how everything fits together. And contrib documentation is often wrong or just completely absent. This was just last year, I needed a library to go with a contrib module that I had gotten from Drupal.org, and I had to go find that library on archive.org, the Internet Archive, because the modules page had a link that was going to a Russian spam site. Like, it was just not being maintained at all. So why should you go the extra mile to keep making Drupal usable for people like us? Drupal wouldn't be what it is today without us. And this is what I was really, frankly, shocked and happy to see Dries say the exact same things. That's right, we are ambassadors. We're evangelists for Drupal. As you all know, 20 years ago, Dries first open sourced the forum software that he coded in his dorm room. And if you weren't around then, you really can't underestimate the huge influence that Howard Dean's website had in 2004 when he ran for president. He used Drupal, and his distribution was called Dean Space, and it was later turned into a public distro called Civic Space. And so many of us in the nonprofit and advocacy world were so fired up to see the way that a website could be used as a community building tool. And it created a huge amount of evangelism. Yeah, Kevin. And if you look at people's Drupal.org profiles now, you'll see there's a lot of people, including a lot of folks who are like big contributors and leaders in the community today, that all joined around, as I did, around 2015. So Drupal 4.7 or 5 or so. Someday I'll tell you the story about the site that I started on 4.7 and how I couldn't upgrade it to Drupal 5. Many tears. Oh, cool, Civic Space is still around? I did not know that. So this was the time when I fell in love with Drupal, just as Dries was putting it. I was an enthusiastic evangelist for Drupal in the nonprofit world for many years. So I can totally see why he wants to bring that energy back. It led to huge growth for Drupal. But frankly, it's the Drupal project's own direction for the last decade or so that's leaving us behind, since we weren't considered ambitious enough. Also in 2016, he talked about ambitious digital experiences. Or possibly our type of work isn't profitable enough, or really not that technically interesting to a lot of people building Drupal. So hopefully this year can be a turning point. I don't really know what's going to happen with this new initiative, but I'll be watching it with a large amount of interest. So as a reminder, don't forget about us. We aren't non-technical users. Please don't call us that. We have a lot less resources than you have. We work with small teams and small budgets. We sometimes only work on a small number of sites at a time. I personally take care of 2 Drupal sites, for example, but I'm the only one who takes care of them, and I do other stuff. We have to figure a lot of things out on our own, so please help us with support and documentation. And remember that our experience is important because we are a big part of what made Drupal the great platform that it is today. I did it in 15 minutes. Woo! Let me see if there's any questions. I absolutely did not keep up with the chat. Oh, great. Are there any modules that I'm going to miss? No, I don't know yet, actually, but I'm really grateful for the reprieve, actually, because I was planning to have already upgraded to D8 last year. So I'll be doing it this year, and I will be learning. So I don't know which ones I'm missing yet. Does anybody else have pointers or thoughts about either of these two questions from Ted about what big D7 modules aren't available for 8, and from Mauricio, just like, what are the great contrib modules that we love? Like, I can tell you, actually, my favorite module, I got asked this in a job interview once, and I worked it at the time, and then later I couldn't believe it. My favorite Drupal module is views bulk operations. That's like a very site buildery thing, right? Because it's like a power tool for me, and I can set it up so that my users can like do some stuff, but I can limit what they do. But then I can do all kinds of stuff, and I don't have to know like SQL and stuff like that. Kevin asked about suggestions, low code or no code. Yes, I went to one of those sessions yesterday about that. I get what they're trying to say. I'm not sure. I have to think about that, some better language. I haven't used rules recently, so I would not miss it personally. Another question from Ted there. This may not make sense if y'all aren't following the Q&A tab. I'm just responding to questions that show up there. Yes. If people are, yay, VPO love. I'm sorry I couldn't keep up with the chat. If people want, we can convene in the hallway track, or actually maybe we can keep going. Michael, are we allowed to stay in here?
Go, and I'm going to have to jump off to another session, but feel free to keep answering some questions.
Okay, cool. So yeah, this is an interesting question. Caroline says too, like we see low code and no code being used for people who are looking for something like Wix or maybe even like WordPress, which I think WordPress has its place. Don't shoot me. That makes sense. I don't feel like it's the same as site building, because like I use HTML and CSS and stuff all the time. But I also get what they're saying with it. Low code might be a better description, because I don't do no code, but I would say low code. Let's see. Let's go back to the Q&A tab. How often do I find lack of documentation a blocker? Well, this is where Dries' initiative would be helpful, because the biggest problem is just trying to choose. Like a recent module I wanted a couple of years ago, wanted something that would easily put a pop-up on the website, but that we could have an interface for editing it, so that like my coworker could go change the pop-up, and I didn't have to go change code to do it. And there were maybe 3 or 4 different modules that will generate a pop-up window, and each of them documented themselves so differently. And so I couldn't tell which ones had an interface that my colleague would understand, which ones had some of the settings that I want, like have it only pop up every X number of hours or things like that. And then that was also one of the ones where I had to go to archive.org to actually find the library that it required, and things like that. Josh asks, are site builders afraid of console applications? How do they work with Composer? Well, I'm on D8. I haven't even used Composer yet. It's like I have to learn a whole bunch of things, and I'm actually looking forward to learning some new stuff. Although I have like a whole full-time job too, so it's kind of hard. But if there's other site builders here that I'm sure are on D8 if they want to speak to how they use Composer and things like that. Let's see. I'm seeing some good comments about this. Thank you, Eric, for that comment. Fortunately, this is recorded and it's only 15 minutes long, so. All right, cool. I know people are going to want to hop to other sessions, and I see the numbers going down. So I'm going to let people leave. I'll go to the hallway track, room 4, just picking that out of random if anybody wants to chat more about site building. And if anybody's involved with the initiative that Dries talked about on Wednesday, I would love to hear more about it. I don't think a marketplace is like the first thing I would have picked, but I can definitely see the need for it. So thank you so much for coming, everybody. I really appreciate it.